Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I guess we'll start to get started. Excellent. Great. So welcome everybody. My name's Julianne Hogbin. I'm Programme and Networks Director at Climate Strategies. And as I say, we're so grateful for you joining us today and for taking time out of your busy COP27 schedules. We know that everybody is so busy, and so thank you so much for joining us for this event on financing the just transition in diverse economies. We want today's event to bring together themes of just transition with opportunity and with themes of hope, as we see these as key aspects for securing finance for transforming all sectors to Paris alignment. And that's hope and optimism that the responses that we take to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement can in fact deliver better lives, better livelihoods, better communities and futures for all people and all countries. Climate Strategies works with an international network of researchers, and our mission is to bridge the research policy interface in order to catalyse climate action. Therefore, one of our key calls to action between now and COP28 is to focus greater research into understanding and communicating the benefits of a just transition, and to do this using interdisciplinary research that engages stakeholders. We will, sooner or later, need to end our dependency on fossil fuels. And we simply can't extract all of the energy that's underground safely. And so now we have the chance to decide whether that will be an unplanned and disorderly transition, or whether that will be a just transition that leaves no one behind. And therefore, we're delighted to be hosting this event today to talk about the just transition and how it can deliver benefits for all countries. We're very grateful to our co-hosts, Estonia. We've had a number of conversations while organising the meeting today and have been truly blown away by the leadership that Estonia is showing in co-developing their just transition plan. So many thanks for co-hosting the event today. In our role as a convener, we really love at Climate Strategies to bring together diverse perspectives. So we're delighted to be joined by two ministers today to deliver a joint keynote from two quite different countries. And I think it will be a great opportunity to hear about shared experiences, but also differences in experience as well. So I'm really honoured to be inviting the Honourable Simo Kilepa, who is Minister for Environment and Conservation at and Climate at Papua New Guinea. The Honourable Simo Kilepa is the delegation lead for Papua New Guinea and a Member of Parliament in the government of Papua New Guinea. And we're absolutely honoured to have you here today to share your experiences. Thank you so much.
Madam Moderator, thank you for your kind introduction. His Excellency Banyasz Kalas, Minister for Environment of Estonia, Excellencies and distinguished participants, I am pleased to join you in this timely side event, and on my delegation's behalf, I want to thank Climate Strategies for organizing it and for inviting Papua New Guinea as a joint keynote speaker to address you all alongside my counterpart and colleague minister from Estonia, His Excellency Banyasz Kalas. Excellencies and participants, the adverse impacts of climate change remain the single greatest threat to the well-being of humanity and is a serious existential concern for small island developing states, including my own country, Papua New Guinea. The escalating severe weather, long periods of droughts, rising sea levels, and food insecurity arising from climate-related challenges continues to affect the lives and livelihoods of people everywhere. In our country and in the Pacific region, we have been the canary of the coal mine for a long time in calling this out for urgent remedial actions to be taken by the global community. I would underscore Papua New Guinea's strong commitment to the Paris Agreement and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, as these are the needed foundations for us to build on going forward. This includes focusing on phasing out diesel power plants in 16 of our 22 provinces, where fossil fuel is the main source of energy for all socio-economic activities, including electricity. Energy transition and financing is important for us all, a developing country, and ambitious commitments. We remain committed to our ambition, and support is the key of all areas of implementation to achieve our energy targets. Financing, technology transfer, and capacity building are very important to enable us to deliver on our ambition for energy transition. Climate financing, in fact, is a major concern that remains for us and needs to be addressed adequately and urgently. Energy transition towards decarbonization for us at the pace and scale needed will be only possible if the support we needed for this sector is predictable, timely, and sustained. Key areas for support is our energy transition includes appropriate, affordable, and accessible technology and technical assistance for capacity building of our human resource and institution. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in the closing, let me once again thank you all for the opportunity to address this event. I will unfortunately be with you for a short while as I have another official engagement to attend, but the chairman of Papua New Guinea National Energy Authority, who is with me, will remain to respond to any questions and comments raised on the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd now like to welcome to the stage His Excellency Banyasz Kallas, who has a long history in the Estonian government, in local politics, and was the mayor for, I have to get the pronunciation right, Saaremaa, no, that's a hard one, municipality. So thank you so much for joining us. Please welcome to the stage.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, Minister from Latvia also. I am first to say that Saaremaa is correct, friends. Yeah, but it was almost, yeah. It is my great pleasure and honor to join with you today. And first of all, I want to say one important thing. More than half of our land is covered by forest, and we have some of the cleanest air in the world. Even though we are blessed with our nature, it has come with historical legacy and pollution from decades back to deal with. We have made great efforts to improve the status of our environment and preserve it for future generations. The main resource used in Estonia for energy production is oil shale. It has now been used for more than 100 years. In 2011, nearly 90% of all electricity produced in Estonia was from the same oil shale. The energy system in Estonia, as well as our economy, is going toward a fast green transition. Our aim is to achieve climate neutrality by 2050 and aiming to phase out oil shale-based energy production by 2040. When we talk about the just transition in Estonia, I mean specifically alleviating the negative impacts of phasing out of oil shale in energy productions. In 2019, the oil shale industry accounted for an estimated 5% of the national economy and 2.5% of total employment. The oil shale sector is also Estonia's largest polluter and highly concentrated in the easternmost region in Estonia, Ida-Virumaa. The transformation in this region has a cascading impact both of local businesses and municipalities of Ida-Virumaa region. The number of employees of the core companies of the sector has been in steady decline since the 90s, halving by size. Given the profile of the oil shale sector, households and associated risk factors, in the worst case scenario, approximately 8,000 more people are at risk of falling below poverty line as the result of the transitions. What recommendation we can give is to organize the transitions, making sure that community is on board. In order to do that, we have organized and implemented a comprehensive partnership when developing our just transition plan. For example, on the national level, a steering committee was set up by the Minister of Finance to both prepare and monitor the implementation for just transition plan. On the regional level, the Union of Local Municipalities created a regional just transition platform to exchange information and know-how. We also made sure to organize a lot of public consultation activities, public seminars, formal written consultation, focus groups, discussion with individual stakeholders groups, public communication and information dissemination. Just transition is a priority for Estonia and for our government. There is no time to lose, and we need to make sure that we both accomplish our climate goals and to do it fair and equitably way. In this view, just transition is paramount. The future of the just transition in Estonia leads us to climate neutrality, not only this or that region. In that sense, the just transition in Ida-Virumaa is a great pilot for us as to how to organize the transition to climate neutrality in the rest of Estonia and Europe in the near future. It is clear climate change is something we cannot ignore, not in our respective countries or globally. As countries, as individuals, we need to take significant actions and step toward shifting the career in the favorable direction for the humankind. With this note, I've finished my invitation, and lastly, I would like to thank the UNFCCC for hosting us. This has allowed to bring together experts from all around the globe to share their knowledge and good practice on just transition. I'm wishing you a successful event and inspiring discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you again to both the ministers for joining us today and showing that political leadership which is so needed in just transition planning. I'd now like to welcome to the stage our panel, which will take us further afield around the world where we can share more experiences. So I'll first welcome, I don't have the list, but I know that we are being moderated from now on by Megan. So, yes, Megan, please come, welcome to the stage, and shall I leave the podium to you, or? Yeah, but yes, thank you so much.
Enough space for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, if we can ask all the panellists to come and join us on stage. Thank you so much again to the ministers, and we'll delve deeper into their experiences around the world. Thank you so much. Welcome to stay. Thank you.
Just while everybody's coming up, I will just briefly tell you who we have on the panel, and then we will dive right in. We have Helena Garcia, who's associated researcher and policy consultant with the Fedesarroyo Institute of Colombia. Then we have Kadi Riskok, director of the climate department at the Ministry of the Environment of Estonia. Kate Hughes, who is senior climate change specialist with the Asian Development Bank. Ben Odongo, who is an Energy Youth Fellow and a United Nations climate champion from Uganda. Then we have Deepthi Swami, who is the climate program lead for the World Resources Institute in India. And we are supposed to be having Anila Anger-Kravi, who's an EU negotiator, and also on the UNFCCC Katowice Committee on the impacts of the implementation of response measures. But I think Anila is in negotiations, right?
I think it's a good point to mention that the response measures negotiations are carrying on, and they are the point where the just transition rubber hits the road. So
Right.
really interesting. But we do have another negotiator from the response measures, and that is Renzi, who's also joining the stage.
Right.
from
Hello,
Papua New Guinea.
Renzi. Hi. There's a seat Renzi, or there's a seat over here, whichever you prefer. Renzi Panda is acting manager of policy in the Policy and Planning Division of the National Energy Authority in Papua New Guinea. So welcome to all the panelists. The idea of this discussion is to dive a little bit more deeply into some of the benefits that can be reaped from a just transition, because I think the discussion at the moment, as it's sort of fairly early stages, tends to be a lot of focus on the negative side of a just transition and who is going to lose out as we transition out of fossil fuels. And there's a lot of worry, a lot of concern, I think, when idea of just transition gets raised, that it's going to be more about the energy transition and not so much about the just. And I feel also within this process here in the UNFCCC that is still the main focus, even though we have the Just Energy Transition Partnership for South Africa, and then this week at the G20 in Bali, we had a Just Energy Transition Partnership announced for Indonesia. But to me, there was a lot of discussion about coal and moving away from coal, and not so much about, how doing so could actually benefit people. And I think there's a lot of worry that perhaps in communities it won't benefit people, and that one of the problems is that, how do you make sure that the transition can work for people? And in terms of getting investment and finance for a just transition, it's important, I think, that, it's seen to be a positive thing. Otherwise, it's just about cleaning up, moving from dirty to clean, and not so much about how we can all win from a transition like this. So what we're going to do is talk a little bit to each of the panelists, and they're going to share their experiences with us, because they've got diverse experiences geographically and also from different disciplines. We have researchers, we also have government people, and also representative of youth. So it would be good to hear their various experiences, and then we will tie those all together and pull out some of the main messages that we're getting. So first of all, we're going to start with Helena, who is actually from Mexico, right? You're a Mexican economist and political scientist, but you are currently working in Fedesarroyo, which is Colombia's leading economic think tank. So Helena, welcome. I'd like to ask you a question about how integrating a just transition framework into Colombia's NDC and development strategies can actually create social and environmental benefits.
Thank you so much, Megan.
I think you have to speak quite close to the microphone, otherwise it's quite hard to hear in these rooms.
Thank you so much. I think this is better. Thank you so much, Megan. And first of all, I would like to thank Climate Strategies and the Ministry of Environment of Estonia for this invitation. As you were saying, it's very important when we think about a just transition on all the benefits that come with it, and not just thinking on how we're adding more costs and more complexity to what is already a very complex and costly problem. So in the case of Colombia, I think when we think about what's the just transition framework that we should be thinking of all the time when we design and when we implement as well any type of climate action and obviously other policies for the development agenda. On one hand is, as you all know, leave no one behind. And what does this actually entail? It means that that the cost of these policies should not go to any particular group, and ideally not groups that have historically been left behind, or in countries like Colombia where inequality is very high, that we're not adding more to this inequality. And the second part of a just transition framework is we should be thinking of various types of support. So having a very broad toolkit of policies to implement and actually be able to achieve a just transition. So when we design these and implement mitigation and compensation measures, this broad toolkit also means coordinated action. And I think that's maybe the hardest part to achieve. In the case of Colombia, development strategies that have been in place and we have been trying to achieve for a long time, more than 3 decades, 4 decades more. Yes, thanks. On one hand, it's how does Colombia diversify its exports and make them more sophisticated? On a second level, how do we make firms more productive? And on a third level, and I'm being very broad here, but it's how do you make the labor force more formal, right? And these 3 big development goals are completely aligned with Colombia's NDC, or can be completely aligned with Colombia's NDC in how you design and implement these measures. Just as an example, when we think about energy efficiency measures, on one hand, we're achieving a reduction in CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gases, and on the second hand, we're also making firms more productive, and ideally that opens the door for more formality, better salaries for workers, and better products that can lead to better exports. So that's just one example how you can achieve some of these development goals that we have been working on for a long time, and also achieve our climate goals. So once again, just to close up, there are many, many benefits, but it requires coordinated action. So this is not new. These are not new benefits. It's something we've been trying to do, and now we have the excuse, quote unquote, to do it faster.
What a sort of coordinated action are you talking about, Helena? What sectors are going to be most affected in Colombia, and what are the challenges to getting that coordinated action?
So coordinated action means for climate change, we all know we need a very broad consensus on one hand, but also from the side of the government for years, if not centuries, government has been specializing, right? So we have the Ministry of the Environment, Ministry of Mines, Ministry of Energy, Ministry of Transport, and everyone is doing what belongs to their agenda. In order to have efficient and impactful climate action that also leads to these other development objectives, we need to be working cross boundaries, and that's not easy to do. 1, because we're not used to doing it. 2, structures are not designed that way. And 3rd is the human factor that sometimes it's hard to work together. So I think that's a big challenge that we need to overcome, not only in Colombia, I think in every country, but we need to find ways to do that. What's a possibility? Thinking about iterative action. So we make little experiments, so to speak, or little initiatives, and from there you grow this consensus. So this helps us learn how to work together, and this also brings some of the benefits we were just talking about, and we're able to grow them and build a broader base that can actually help us push forward in this agenda that's going to take Not until 2025, not until 2030. It's going to take decades. And we need to prepare and think about how we work together. You were asking about what sectors will be the most impacted. So on one hand, you can think about sectors that are impacted by climate policy. The first one, obviously, is the oil and gas sector, as Colombia tries to move towards a low-carbon economy. And this is difficult not only of the people who are directly involved in these sectors, so the workers, the firms, but also because oil and coal are two of Colombia's main exports today. So the fiscal revenues that come from those sectors mean that directly you are also affecting regions and the ability of the government to provide services. So this is something we need to think about not only from a narrow perspective of the workers and the sector, but how it impacts the whole economy upstream and downstream.
Thank you very much for that. Now I'm going to turn to Kadi Riskok, who is Director of the Climate Department for the Estonian Ministry of the Environment. Kadi, we heard a little bit there about, from your minister, about the oil shale industry and how Estonia needs to transition away from that and how that's going to have quite a big impact on the economy and on communities, and you have a plan. And it would be great if you could just explain a little bit more about how you're planning to sort of manage that transition in order to sort of get benefits for the economy, and also how you're going to include those communities that are affected in the planning process. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Indeed, our historical legacy is an energy sector that was almost fully dependent on oil shale, which has enormous emissions. So it's definitely needed for us to move on from that. And what is the particularity in Estonia? And I know maybe there's other countries similar to like that. For us, most of the production of oil shale and the production of energy out of oil shale takes place in one region where we have around 150,000 people living. So most of their economy has been dependent on that sector for a long time. And it's also very related to their way of seeing themselves, the way they define themselves, and the value they bring to the society. So I think the approach that we took since the beginning is that the just transition is not just a matter of numbers, of building a new economy. It's also a matter of culture and a matter of people. So the process of constructing our just transition plan has been quite long, actually. We started it in the beginning of 2020. And it just came to an end now in October 2022. The first stage was, of course, a very large public outreach to listen to people, to ask from different groups, different economic sectors, from the local governments, from different ministries, how they perceive the future of this region and how they see the development needs of this region, so that we start from a common path and we understand the same, we're in the same information room to begin with. I think what was also important in the public outreach part of constructing the plan was taking different time perspectives. It was important to listen to the people in active employment age who actually need to transit quite fast, to think about what are the options for them, but to also think about the youth who are only now studying in school and they have to make their future choices, and they are also related to the kind of economy and the options we're going to have in this region in the future, in the years to come. So that was the first stage, and the development needs that came out of this public outreach, they were three main things. Of course, the economy needs to be restructured. The proposals that came out were to build a new modern manufacturing that would be way cleaner, less emissions, but also a viable service economy. And the development of economic sectors that have higher added value. What came out as well is that the youth see themselves working in creative jobs and also IT sector. So this is what gave kind of the direction to what kind of economic sectors we should be developing. Then the second development need was, of course, supporting the people and the communities. There were reskilling needs, both short and long term, re-education, but also starting with the main pillars of educating the youth. Needs for new schools, even higher education and professional education needs. And the third development need was to actually re-establish the state of the nature, because the nature has also been suffering of the impacts of producing oil shale and energy based on that. So those are the main directions that the plan is taking as well.
That's super interesting to hear some of the concrete ways that the young people especially were thinking that their future employment would be different from, you know, their older generations. And I'm just wondering, I mean, obviously just transition plans cost money because you have to change the way things are organized, you have to provide training and new economic options for communities. How will the Just Transition Plan in Estonia be funded?
So in the European Union, we have a Just Transition Fund that is dedicated to regions that have to transition out of fossil fuels. One of those regions is this region in Estonia. And so we have a public funding of 340 million euros that is going to be given in grants in this region. It's going to be with a huge focus on small and medium-sized enterprises who have an important place in the local community as well as economy. They're closer to people, but there's also some bigger manufacturing projects that are going to benefit of this fund. And then there's also some public sector loan facilities and schemes of investment together with the public sector guarantees. All that being said, I think it's a very, very good beginning, but what's also needed is that we manage to now engage the private sector financing, that the private banks come along and also see the future of this region.
Thank you, because I think it's just important to know, you know, where the money is going to be coming from, basically. And I mean, in Europe, I guess we're relatively lucky. I live in Spain, although I'm from the UK. You know, that there is this thinking going on about where the funding is going to come from, and it's part of the European Green Deal. And perhaps some of the work is relatively advanced in terms of thinking about where the investment is going to come from. Spain, for example, is also organising in its regions to do similar exercise, because they also have they've been closing coal mines and talking to communities and unions about how to have a just transition, and also I think perhaps tapping up the same EU fund as well. We're going to move on and talk about Asia now with Kate Hughes, who works for the Asian Development Bank. And Kate is basically leading the development of ADB's Just Transition Agenda, which is going to support countries to manage a just transition across all their different sectors. And you've got 18 years of experience on working on climate change and sustainable development across the region. So I think, Kate, you're in a very good position to explain to us how MDBs, the multilateral development banks, are going to use their operations that they already have, as well as national social programs, to basically accelerate just transition financing and implementation in Asia. And I think, this is something that's picking up speed with the Indonesian partnership that we've just seen announced this week. So, yes, please explain to us a little bit about how the MDBs can push this along.
Sure, and thanks very much for having me. So I think maybe first, before talking about the specific financing, some of the kind of foundational principles on how we approach the just transition that help us design the financing. So it's really good to hear the mention about the positive side of the agenda. As an MDB, we're really approaching just transition as an enabling agenda. The Asia-Pacific region has, huge potential for innovation, youth. We've seen huge economic growth and development in the region. So how can we capitalize on that as part of the transition? I think two of the other kind of foundational principles in how we approach the just transition is the fact that the just transition brings in different stakeholders into the climate discussion. So you bring in, in governments, you bring in different ministries of education, ministries of labor, and also in the financiers, you bring in those with some slightly different perspectives or maybe focus areas. The third, I think, is early intervention. So, when we look at what type of financing we need to do, it's actually the financing that needs to come first before a lot of the decarbonisation activities or even adaptation activities can happen. As you mentioned, that's the work that needs now, and the financing is needed now. So we need to look for how we can mobilise fast financing now to support that, whereas perhaps some of the financing for climate action will come later. In terms of how we design and think about it as an MDB, how we can finance it. So the first one is we're just looking at how we integrate just transition into our operations. So as an institution, what type of framework do we develop for it? How does it interface with things like the way we do poverty and social analysis before lending? How does it fit in with our safeguards frameworks? That type of integration into operations. The second is just transition specific support, and we're actually designing a fund. So we launched a Just Transition platform on Monday. It starts with technical assistance, but the plan is to design a fund, and we'll look for examples like the EU Just Transition Fund, and that's where we can have specific financial resources to provide grants or highly concessional funds that are specifically focused on just transition. And that might be where we work with a region or a subnational government and design a programmatic support that's labelled just transition. And then I think the third aspect, which is perhaps not talked about much, but I think has great potential, is how to mobilise finance, non-climate finance, for the just transition. And that's actually where we're trying to do a lot of work internally. So the MDBs and a lot of other development partners and institutions, they already finance education support, health support, urban development support, work on crowding in private sector, finance all of those operations and all of, for ADB, our pipeline and our strategic engagement in those sectors, how do we start to shift them so that they are linked to the transition discussion in a country, so that they're linked to the NDC, and so that, you know, all of that other financing can then be mobilized towards supporting a just transition.
Now that's a very good point, because I know you were talking about the need for this sort of coordinated action and getting people to work together who haven't necessarily, you know, done so before. But I mean, Kate, you're absolutely right. If you don't do that, then you'll be missing out on vital kind of shifts that need to happen in other sectors like education and possibly health as well, but also potentially on funding. I mean, you know, the talk here is all about how there's not enough funding. So, I mean, not enough within the climate space at the moment, though clearly there's a lot more out there in the wider world. So, I mean, I guess, you know, that's part of this work, is like looking to see how you can recalibrate money and bring it into this work. Have any of the other multilateral development banks done work on this that you can sort of coordinate with, learn from, and so that we're not sort of reinventing the wheel each time?
Sure. So we actually have a joint MDB Just Transition Working Group, which I chair at the moment. So not to go into too much detail, but the MDBs have a framework for Paris alignment of the operation, and it has several building blocks under that. And one of the building blocks is on strategy, engagement and policy support. So we have a Just Transition Working Group that sits under that. So we did announce joint principles ahead of COP26 for the MDBs to guide just transition. But I think now the big focus is on how we move forward from those principles on implementation. I think there's a lot of benefits from working together on it. And just to give you a bit of a flavour of some of the things we're doing. So one is on harmonisation of approaches. So, you know, a lot of, to start the discussion on just transition and design just transition interventions, you do need upstream analysis, right? You need to start to look at the costs, those potential impacts and quantify them. But it's not helpful if all the MDBs approach that type of assessment in different ways. So, for example, in India, we're working very closely with the World Bank on how we approach socioeconomic impact assessment in a consistent manner so that we can provide similar assessments. And then I think on another way is how, I mean, the challenge is huge, right? So I use India again as an example because we're talking a lot on that at the moment, but you know, there's 58 coal mining districts that need investment in India. So no single MDB or no single financier can do that. So how do we work together so that we can allocate some to some MDBs or others and take a more sort of programmatic and coordinated approach? And then I think the third is similar to my point before, is to know the other types of activities that the MDBs are doing, so that if you are, you know, for example, MDB may have a very strong, one MDB may have a very strong program on renewable energy development in a particular region. So if we want to engage in that region and support that subnational government on just transition, then it's very pertinent that another MDB or another institution or some lender might be supporting renewable energy, because that's going to be part of the just transition planning. So I think coordinating on that and being aware of what the others are doing is also really important.
It's encouraging to hear that there's these discussions going on, especially because there's quite a lot of pressure on the MDBs at the moment to kind of up their game on climate finance and climate action across the board. We're going to hear a little bit from Ben now. We're in Africa, and there's a lot of discussion here about the need for a just transition in Africa, and a lot of African countries are still sort of thinking even of expanding some of their fossil fuel production and extraction and exports. And at the moment we have South Africa that has a Just Energy Transition Partnership. Possibly Senegal may get one, but I know that other countries like Nigeria are basically looking for finance to fund their Just Energy, their energy transition plan as well. Ben, you're a UN climate champion. You're also an energy youth fellow, and you're part of the Youngo constituency, right? And I know that in Uganda is basically one of the countries that's thinking that is planning to participate in the East Africa crude oil pipeline. It will start in Uganda, right, and go to Tanzania. You know, as a young representative of Ugandan youth at these talks and in this discussion here, how important is it for you that the Ugandan government invests in a just transition? And what kind of social benefits would you be hoping that would create, both for youth today and Ugandan and African youth in the future?
Thank you for that question. I mean, I think it's a broad topic, so maybe we'll not cover like all the aspects. But I think for me, from my work, especially like within energy, I think one of the things that I notice is that most of the time when we talk about transition, energy transition, we think about it from the point of view of, going from fossil fuel to renewables. And I think like that conversation is like being very reductive, because yes, to a transition basically means that, we're acknowledging like there's a reduction in emissions, there's also like an environment benefit. And I think what we often tend to leave out when we discuss about the transition is just the fact that, there are also other issues here like employment, so there are jobs, there is also an issue of health and all these other core benefits that go with the transition. So when you speak about, oil and gas, obviously the debate is really around that, oil and gas has a better promise on jobs, has a better promise on economic development, and all those other arguments that are being made. And for me, I feel that if this conversation was much more broader than comparing to fuel or to energy sources, I think it would be pointing towards a much more right direction, because when you transition to renewable energy, it doesn't mean that you're going to have no more jobs, and so there's even just a tendency to think that all the transition work has to be led by government. It's a non-profitable kind of venture, and private sector cannot come in. It's government we should be leading, or maybe development partners and things like that. But I actually believe, from what we have seen with this little progress that has been made so far, with especially with renewable energy in Africa, in that allowing or giving people access to cleaner energy not only turns the light on, but also, it has a bigger benefit, for the environment, but also, for their own health. And we see that some of the leading organizations in the world, like World Health Organization, has been very key in just reporting, how the transition to cleaner energy is going to have a very positive impact on health, because currently there are more than like 500,000 or 500,000 deaths that are just attributed to indoor air pollution, and that is directly coming from using fossil fuel. We can also talk about like the International Labour Organization, which has also been championing the conversation around resilience and basically letting us know that when we transition, we are going to actually create much more resilient jobs, So it's not just that the transition is one fuel to another, but I think it's it's a much more bigger conversation, and I think we need to start broadening the scope of the conversation beyond fossil fuel versus renewables.
No, absolutely. And I mean, I think for the future, hopefully for your generation will be, it will be one of in clean energy. But in your experience, from what you've seen, what you've heard, what you've studied, do you feel as if there is enough effort being put into sort of preparing young people for these greener jobs and the opportunities that might come with them?
Yeah, I mean, I think more effort needs to be done on the part of just making sure, like, first of all, like, the myth are demystified, and like, there's a very clear, like, we're talking on things based on facts. So I would say, like, if I'm to give an example from Uganda, when Uganda started discussions around, the exploration of the oil and gas, we had a petroleum institute, which was on ground to train, graduates on petroleum exploration and all jobs in relation to, the oil and gas sector. And like a lot of youth, a lot of young people, decided, like, this is the future. This is oil and gas is here. I want to study oil and gas. There's an institute that I can quickly, enroll. There were, of course, sponsorships to study those courses. But you don't see the same when it comes to renewable energy. If you want to learn about renewable energy, it takes a lot of personal dedication. I think there's just, like, not enough effort, either it's from government, but also, like, from just private sector, because there's also, like, a business opportunity here. So I think the transition, the just transition that we are talking about, that clearly is one of the areas. Because when it comes to youth and our own perceptions, like, personally, I've been involved in, like, renewables for 8 years, and I can tell you confidently that more and more youth are very conscious, about their consumption habits, about, fossil fuel and the destruction that it has on the environment and all these other elements. But then when it just comes to the kind of work that they can then do, so more youth are aware about the problem of fossil fuel than they are aware about the opportunities in renewable energy. And I think that's the biggest challenge we have.
That's an absolutely crucial point. I mean, I've heard a lot of activism here, for example, Don't Gas Africa, and on the sort of negative side of the fossil fuels. But equally, if there is going to be a just transition, then there also needs to be opportunities created and education around the clean energy and renewables, which, that needs to come from government, and then once young people have that information, then they can start to come up with their own ideas as well and develop businesses based around the green transition. But clearly there's still quite a lot of heavy lifting to do on that front. Thanks very much, Ben. Deepthi, we're going to talk about India now, where I think work on just transition is advancing, right? I think that I have a team of reporters working on just transition coverage, and 2 of them are in India, and what we're doing is looking both at the impacts on coal on communities, because India is actually still increasing coal production wanting to, at the same time that it's also expanding renewables. So you've got this quite interesting dynamic in India of both sides of the energy equation sort of going up, but even in the green energy space, there are also some negative impacts on communities. So we're looking at both the good things and the bad things around that. And Deepthi, you basically use a systems approach to look at low carbon pathways for a clean and just energy transition. So could you tell us how the work you're doing, quantitative analysis and research, suggests that the just transition will actually bring social and economic benefits for people in India? Because I think in many cases communities are not seeing that right now or understanding it.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Megan. So I think just to go back to your point on this just transition, the whole just dimension is very unique to each region. And with India, which is which has a high population density, we're seeing that the scale of transformation that we need for the kind of targets that we've committed to, which is 500, we are seeing within the modeling that we'll get close to the 500 gigawatt number by 2030. And that means that's a lot of land, which is currently has competing usage. And so that's the other side of the transition that you're seeing, where it's just not about moving away from coal, but also making space for new clean technologies, power generation technologies, and how that affects the communities that are currently dependent on that land in various ways for livelihood, for agriculture. So yeah, that's one aspect of it. Within the modeling that we do, we are essentially looking at long-term low carbon pathways and what that means at a systemic level. So all the energy actions that we have to take, all the decarbonization actions measures that we have to deploy across various sectors like transport, electricity, industry, the good news is that the modeling indicates that the transition at an aggregate level can create more jobs. So there's, with reference to a baseline where we continue as we are on fossil fuel dependent economy, we see that a shift away to a clean economy can actually increase GDP by 2.2% over projected baseline levels by 2050. And also generate close to 3.5 additional million jobs. And a lot of it is driven by the new industries that are going to come. So fossil-free electricity generation is going to be a big driver for investments and jobs. Increased investments in the economy also has trickle-down effects in terms of increasing household savings and improving spending in the economy, and that creates like second-order positive impacts in the economy. There's also the demand for new services, allied services, like if we are switching to clean electricity vehicles, we are going to see more manufacturing, and even in the new hydrogen production and infrastructure space, there's going to be more jobs created. So on a net aggregate effect, it's good news. We are essentially seeing that given the twin challenge of development and decarbonization that India has, that it's not about one versus the other, but the clean development can actually improve the economy in the long run. To add to that, to come to the just transition aspect of it, I think what we need more modeling on is essentially how these impacts are distributed. Because at the aggregate level, yes, the effects are positive, but there are going to be some regions which are going to face adverse impacts. There's going to be some sectors and some sections of the population which are going to be losers, and there's going to be winners. And the question is, how do we plan for this transition so that we already have existing disparities and we don't make them worse, but rather, like you said, use that as an opportunity to improve some of the indicators that we have. So just to give an example, so the largest job losses that we are seeing is in the coal mining sector. We lose about, we are seeing that we can approximately 300,000 jobs are lost by 2050. And most of the coal economy jobs are related to either coal mining or thermal power production. And these are concentrated in 4 states in India. So I'm talking about the subnational level. So they're concentrated in 4 states, and these are the states which together only account for 7% of the national installed renewable capacity. And they are not the most resource endowed in terms of renewable energy. So they are not going to be the beneficiaries of the new clean power electricity generation that we're going to see within these states. So that is one regional aspect. So we need to think about economic diversification within these areas and social safety nets for workers who are not able to migrate from coal jobs, like older workers and women. And within the manufacturing sector itself, we are seeing a net increase in jobs, but the type of jobs are changing. So from fossil-intensive manufacturing jobs, we move to more specialized manufacturing jobs, which essentially means that there's more, fabricated metal products and machinery, electronic equipment, which essentially points to a need for reskilling. And one of the ways in which, how you were mentioning, we can turn this into an opportunity is to look at existing working conditions for women. So, for example, create more enabling provisions for women to pick up new skills for the new job market, and improve the labor force participation, which is currently only 19% compared to the global average of 46%. And the third important sort of insight I would like to bring to this conversation is this, it's often not talked about, but the current economy, the government revenue, the way the government earns revenues in the economy, a large part of it is dependent on fossil fuels. So in the recent years, we've seen up to 20 to 25% of government revenues are coming from petroleum and diesel excise duties. And if we are looking at the scale of transformation that is required to align with a net zero pathway, then we have to think of alternative ways to augment government revenue, because otherwise it has impacts on productive expenditure of government on basic services like health and education and public infrastructure, which is again going to hurt the economy. So yeah, so these two things.
Absolutely, there just are so many different aspects that kind of have to be thought through. It's a lot of work. I'm going to move now to Renzi Panda, who works in the National Energy Authority in Papua New Guinea and is chair of the Energy Sub-Technical Committee. And we heard from your Minister Renzi about how PNG is quite dependent on fossil fuels, and so the challenge at the same time of being vulnerable to climate change, means that it's not going to be an easy transition for PNG. Could you tell us about some of the challenges that you're facing, and also in terms of finding investment and financing to help you deal with those?
Thank you. And if I may start by thanking the climate change strategies for this event. And from the outset, let me begin by saying that this COP process needs to give us a decision on just transition and linkages with the financial mechanism to support implementation in countries. If you look at the examples given by the Minister of Estonia, the director from the Ministry of Environment Estonia, and also few other colleagues on the panel, you will note that just transition right now is a voluntary approach taken by many countries to address the gray areas in mitigation ambition that nobody wants to talk about. And it's unfortunate that the current funding mechanisms under the UNFCCC, the Global Environment Facility really doesn't have much stake, because it's a transition funding mechanism. It's still tied to other priorities in the other conventions, which is not really useful to our cause when we talk about NDC implementation in countries. And of course, the Green Climate Fund, it's broad in its priorities. So from the outset, the COP has to give us a decision on just transition as an intervention tool to support and raise ambition, especially in developing countries. It's very, very sympathetic for many countries on an annual basis when they come to this process, and we repeat ourselves when we call for a 1.5 global emission global goal, and also stronger calls to phase out fossil fuel, and also other related calls to coal expansion and development as well. And I think the Glasgow Pact is a classical example of that. If you look at some of the examples raised in the intervention by our youth colleague in the room, from the who's also an Energy Youth Fellow, he also pointed out some of the stark realities that will affect countries across the board in the next 10 to 20 years. Our minister, in his statement, he emphasized the energy targets of Papua New Guinea, short-term and long-term, in his statement, where our enhanced NDC speaks to our ambition to have a 70% renewable energy target by 2030 and 100% carbon neutrality by 2050. The only thing that stands between us and the achievement of those ambition are some of the issues and challenges that have been pointed out by the panelists here. And I think India probably laid out some very stark realities with how the challenges the sectors in our countries will have in terms of transitioning out from the traditional energy sources to renewable energy. Now, if I have to make the linkages with how important the traditional energy sources are in Papua New Guinea, Papua New Guinea is heavily reliant on most of our sea transportation routes and air transportation routes. We have a lot of landlocked provinces. We have 22 provinces which can only be accessible effectively by air and sea as well. So you can already imagine the consumption rate of imported fuel into the country. And also, not to mention, our land transport system is also heavily dependent on fossil fuel. And the other biggest consumer of fossil fuel is our electricity sector. In the minister's speech, 70%, which is 70% of the nation coverage, which is 16 of the 22 provinces, they rely on fossil fuel for their diesel generators in terms of electrification, rural electrification. And in PNG as well, the base load for electricity is dependent on fossil fuel as well. And we do have our challenges with aging technology and other related issues. And one of the things that it's going to be very problematic when you don't take on board just transition and the need to have a separate or a linkage funding mechanism for it, it's going to be very difficult for countries to actually move away from the business as usual approach that they have. Our youth fellow and rep on the panel made a point which stood out for me, and which is also very relevant to Papua New Guinea, is that most of these investors, especially in the oil and gas sector, when they come to Papua New Guinea, they also contribute immensely to the socio-economic livelihoods, especially of the people in the places where they operate and they work in. He gave a specific example of education and training. That is also, it also exists in PNG in terms of the support that we receive from this company. And you are looking at a possible major overhaul of an industry that has existed for decades and has contributed a lot to the economies of many countries around the world. But the other challenge we also have is that most of the sectors are moving ahead with their technological innovations. And at some point, the global community has to find a balance in between. And that's where the just transition concept comes in. Estonia has given us very good examples of what they are doing in country, and these specific case studies that we can use to push forward the importance of the just transition work. Imagine reaching a point in our life where we will have to phase out all the fossil fuel related transport system. Replaced by electric vehicles, hydrogen-fueled aircrafts, hydrogen-fueled vessels. The International Maritime Organization has gone ahead with strong legal resolution for the production and the refleet of global shipping vessels all across the board. And they even have set deadlines in terms of the regulations of the port of entry and departure of the compliant shipping vessels. The International Civil Aviation Organization have released strong resolutions for their production, the airline production companies, and at some point you will find stranded assets in most of the developing countries and stranded human resource, because nobody wants to talk about just transition and assist most of the developing countries to prepare themselves. So for us, we believe that it's a very timely topic, especially when, you know, both the negative and positive impacts of using traditional energy sources is going to impact us. And we are looking forward to outcomes of this session, and it's good. Actually delighted to say that we have not closed off our contact group on the current negotiations. In the text that we have opportunity to build just transition elements into it. We look forward to more discussions on this, because next year it will be an Arab COP, so obviously all the countries will be looking for some kind of leadership in the space of establishing a financial mechanism for just transition. And I would conclude by saying that as we speak, we do not want to be also stranded with our human resource assets. At some point, we will also have to prepare our education systems and even our universities, so it will be easy to transition our manpower, so that at some stage we will know that we can be able to have licensed solar experts, licensed hydrogen experts, licensed electrical vehicle experts, and all this type of green job expertise in our country, so that we remain true to the principles of the SDGs in terms of no one being left behind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Renzi. That was really, really fascinating to find out more about the particular challenges. You know, whether it's, you know, how do you change your entire economy from using fossil fuels to using green energy without resources? I mean, it's just not going to be possible. And also when the benefits coming from fossil fuels are perhaps still seen by people as larger, right? As you were saying as well, Ben, I think, you know, that's a social issue as well. And how do you tackle that? And the idea that there would be a financial mechanism for just transition, I guess if we get the loss and damage facility here, then maybe next year will be the turn of just transition. But it does very much seem to me that there is no particular source of financing for international financing for just transition beyond these JETPs, which are very narrow and just a handful of countries, and there are, you know, a whole lot more, 120 odd countries that are going to need this support as well. So where is that going to come from? Is there anybody in the audience who would like to ask a question or make a comment? I think we have some microphones. We have about 10 minutes or so if anybody would like to contribute to the conversation or respond to what we've heard. Please put your hand up and we can arrange for a microphone. If not, I can ask, yep, we have one person over here. I think we're just about to bring a microphone to you. It's coming. Yep. Oh, we have two. Sorry. Oh, we have three. Excellent. Wow. Okay. Let's collect those, and then I think we'll collect them, and then we'll get the panel to respond. Excellent.
Thank you, moderator. Satoru Mizuguchi, freelance journalist. The last lady mentioned the necessity of just transition finance mechanism. My question is there any discussion about just transition finance mechanism in the negotiation levels? If anyone knows, please teach me. Thanks.
Very good question. Okay, we'll collect the questions and then we'll direct them to the panelists. So that was, sir.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I think mine would be just a contribution to add to what has already been said. My name is Chinon Sabo, and we're working on, trying to talk about job transition for Nigeria, for example. It's a work that will soon commence. But the concept of transparency in the process, because while we began our stakeholder engagement in some of our recent activities, we were able to see the essence of transparency in the process and how it was able to bring critical stakeholders, especially those affected by the process, to the mainstream. So once transparency is mainstreamed down to the finance level, down to the process of technology change, down to innovation, down to the research component, it has a way of reducing the tension and bringing all hands on deck. So even while we are talking about transition, the just must also come with transparency. So if there's no transparency in the system, then we are going to have multiple setbacks at the long run. That's from experience we've had from our interactions. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a super important point, especially in countries where the governance is perhaps not tilted towards transparency. It's a very important consideration.
Felipe Sanchez, Stockholm Environment Institute. I come from Colombia, and just last week the Minister of Mines announced that the Colombian government were kickstarting the process to develop a just energy transition roadmap. And my question, I think, is mainly to Kate. How important are such national just transition roadmaps for NDBs looking to embark on projects that incorporate just transitions? And do you see an active role for MDBs in supporting governments to establish more of these roadmaps?
Thank you. I think we have one more.
Yes. I'm Sangeet. Thank you for the panel. It was very interesting. And I'm with the German Institute for Economic Research in Berlin. My question is also for Kate, but others could answer it as well. And this is more to do with the just part of the just energy transition. The funding for the just part has also come in concessional loans, and a lot of them are not revenue-generating projects. Even though these packages aren't project-specific, for South Africa, in the South Africa case, very little of it is in grants. And while there's no details in Indonesia, I'm pretty sure it's also mostly concessional loans, and the rest is all private. So, should we separate? While the just bit is very important to talk about, should we separate the way we deal with the Just Energy Transition Partnership and just talk about the energy transition, like you've done in Indonesia with the ETM, which I think the ADB has done a lot with Qatar on, and separate out the just bit and de-link those processes, because in this COP cycle, every year we want to have one Jet P announced, and then we want to have here an update, right? And then we never have the time to have the consultative process on what is just, because that needs to be determined by the host countries, which is how it happened in South Africa. They released it and gave it the civil society like 5 days to look at it, and they're all upset because there's no just bit. So do we need to de-link those processes, give the two things different timelines to talk about the just bit and then to talk about the energy transition bit, which is more of a technical engineering system grid question versus the other bit. And I think this also goes for India, so I would love to hear Deepti's thoughts as well on India in specific because of the just challenges there.
Super important question, and echoes a bit of my thinking having watched this this as well. So what I propose is that we answer the specific questions, and then if everybody... Oh, sorry. Please, could you make it brief?
Okay.
Thanks, because we have 10 minutes.
Yeah, sorry. It's just a quick question. Igwebike Joma is my name. In Estonia, for instance, to what extent was the labor union mainstreamed and consulted? To what extent? Because this is a big pressure point in countries like Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent question. So we'll start with Renzi. Renzi, is there actually any concrete discussion of a just transition financial mechanism here at the UNFCCC? And if so, what kind of things are being said?
Thank you. And if you see where we are right now with good progress on the loss and damage funding facility, you would realize that it took us 7 years to be where we are since Paris. So when it comes to any discussions at all on any financial mechanism, it will take time. That's the first part of the response. The second part is that it needs a lot of socializing at the highest political level. So ministerial sessions that will happen tomorrow, those are certain entry points where you start to talk about these things, linking it to higher ambition and why it's important to think about these issues. Now, if we have to look at energy being completely different than loss and damage, adaptation, and other issues, then it gives us a certain degree of comfort that we have a certain angle of privilege where we can push things faster, unlike adaptation or loss and damage, which took 7 years. And then if you strategically look at the lining up of the incoming COP session with the Arab COP coming up in the next 13 months, it's all about how do you work together both at the technical and the political level to push for these things. And then you look back at the work being done by the NDBs, by other parties, unilateral arrangements, bilateral arrangements, multilateral case studies. These are some of the arrangements that can also create momentum towards the COP28, which essentially a lot of countries by default describing it as an energy COP. So the bigger question that goes back to our governments and our politicians is what do you want out of the COP28 process for next year? And when do you start the work?
Now? Let's go to the question on Estonia on the labour unions, and then we'll go to Kate and then bring everybody else in who would like to comment on that just part of the just energy transition.
Yes, so the labour unions were included in the process since the beginning of when we started to make the Just Transition Plan. I must say that in Estonia, the labor unions historically are not very strong. They're not very active, I would say. But they were very strongly engaged in this process. And they became more active as we moved in the process. So what was created was the regional Just Transition platform. There were over 50 different stakeholder groups there. And so the labor unions were part of those groups. And within this platform, there were several types of public outreach and engagement processes going on. There were many seminaries, but also public written consultations so that they could really write down and structure their opinions, their propositions. And and they played an important part in informing and kind of bringing out the points that employees have in common, because in a large group of people it's hard to bring out the what's uniting people, what are the common viewpoints. So they help to bring people together a lot.
Yeah, I think obviously it's very important to include them, and that's happened a little bit in South Africa, I think. But Kate, over to you. How important is it to have a just energy transition roadmap in terms of engaging with the MDBs? And then I think this final question about how do you fund or deal with the just part of the Just Energy Transition Partnership, maybe other people would like to comment on that as well, just to round off after Kate has answered.
Sure. So to answer your question easily, absolutely essential. I think there's a big shift in what we do on that upstream support for all aspects of climate, so not just transition. But particularly on just transition, I think first off, we need some good assessments, some good impact assessments. We have found in some of the work we've done that there's actually a lot of fear about the potential number of jobs that will be lost, but sometimes if you do the analysis, actually the number is not in the same order of magnitude that's being discussed. So I think the first step is to start to do those assessments and really understand and identify where the potential impacts will be. And then to set up a real consultation structure. So as we heard from Estonia, they put a lot of effort into, a platform and how you engage the stakeholders. I think looking to other aspects of that planning that are really key is this idea of early intervention and timing and sequencing of support. So as I said before, the just transition investments or those types of activities, so reskilling, education, that type, a lot of that actually needs to come early and first before the transition happens. So without a good plan and a good approach, then you can't see the sequencing and the timing of what needs to come. I think ultimately for MDBs and for a lot of people, really how we do this is about how we shift the pipeline and how the downstream projects and the downstream investments are identified. And we can't, if we continue to have a policy process here and then a way that we identify pipeline and investments here and not connect them, then we won't be as effective as we need to be. So if we can take that more collaborative, risk-based, informed approach of how we identify the investments and the way the pipelines, the way the MDBs engage with countries, and the way we plan out what activities we're going to do in a country based on robust planning, then we will be more effective, I think is the answer to your question. On the second question, so calling it a just energy transition partnership doesn't necessarily make it just unless you put an effort into the just part. So I think some key things I highlighted before about making sure that the other stakeholders are there. A lot of the discussions on energy transition are with ministries of finance and environment, planning, energy, but we need to involve a lot of other stakeholders for that part of it. For the energy transition mechanism specifically that you mentioned, and for those that don't know, it's a program that ADB is developing for financially structuring it so that you can have early retirement of coal-fired power stations and bring forward the retirement date. So we've done a lot of work on how we finance the just transition part of those transactions, and a lot of it comes down to who can take responsibility for what parts of the elements that need to happen for a robust just transition. So the power plant owner and the financier coming in, to give that example, they can't finance early economic diversification at a subnational level in the region, for example, but they can be responsible for direct workers, indirect workers, vendors that will be impacted, a certain amount along the supply chain. Another example is, say, induced impacts. Someone mentioned lost government revenue. If there's lost government revenue and that will lead to induced impacts and further job losses, who's going to pay for that? So we are doing a lot of work on that. And I mentioned ADB's designing that financing facility. And the idea is that that fund would be able to work alongside some of these other initiatives to provide that financing for the broader just transition. So, not the direct impacts, but the indirect and induced impacts, and provide grant funding to come in. But I think maybe to tie the 2 points together, and then I'll finish. One of the things that really is going to be key for that type of financial structure is how you get all those players to collaborate on a just transition plan. So how do you get those that are directly involved for maybe direct impacts and job loss? How do you get the government, and how do you get the MDB or whoever is there to agree jointly on a financing plan so that overall you have a robust just transition approach? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kate. That's really insightful. We're running a little bit out of time to take more questions. Okay. Do you want to come back? I need a microphone, please, because we can't hear. Could we just wait for a microphone? Sorry. Otherwise, we can't. I'm afraid we can't hear otherwise. Apologies for that. I think it's... It'll be with us shortly. Yeah. And in the meantime, if any of the other panelists would like to come in on this, how do you do the just part of the just energy transition? If you could just make the interventions very quick, I'll take a few.
So I just want to make a comment on the financing of transition. We have a national plan called National Electrification Rollout Plan to bring electricity to every household in PNG. So we take a two-pronged approach. One is funding from donors, but we also have decided that we will involve the private sector. The reason why we want to involve the private sector is that we need operators that will actually manage the mini grids and put the money in and make money from it. So we think it's a good approach instead of relying too heavily on donors. So there's got to be some self-help to actually deliver energy throughout the countries. We cannot wait for too much discussion on where the money is going to come from.
Right.
But we hope that funding will come to help with a smooth transition.
Yeah.
But we have decided to work with the private sector.
Okay.
And we think they will make money from rural electrification.
Yeah, which is also happening in Nigeria, or that's the idea as well. So I think that's very interesting to hear. Thank you very much. Do any of the panelists have anything they would like to contribute briefly on this issue of making sure that energy transition is just and making sure that part of it gets funded? Please, could you just be very brief? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so for me, I think just one thing to really mention about the just aspect is that, of course, the conversation is already moving to countries. So, we're giving examples. Colombia is planning on this, Nigeria is doing this, Uganda is doing this. But I also think that we don't have to reduce that conversation to just countries. We still need to speak at a global level. So if, for example, Uganda, I will use the geography that I'm familiar with, decides to have like a just transition path and transition all their energy to renewables, but like a neighboring country is lagging behind, then we are not like really moving forward in a just way, to be honest, because it means that countries that don't transition will continue to rely on fossil fuel. It will continue to have an impact on the environment. So I think like however much the action needs to happen at a country level, we still need to hold a conversation at a global level and still hold the Global North accountable and still, for the different financing mechanisms that we're talking about, I think those still need to come.
Yeah, we need some equity in who gets the just energy transition support, right? Elena?
Thank you. So I think on one hand, thinking about, as they were asking, so sure, you have the energy transition on one hand, and that's a technical question on how fast, etc. And then thinking about the just transition, in my view, you do have to have a broader perspective, more further than just energy. And it's all climate action and what impacts come from that. Why? On one hand, because of going back to what we were discussing in this panel about making the financial case. So it's all the co-benefits that you can get from the other sectors. If we only say it's a just energy transition, then it's very narrow. We'll go back to the workers in that sector. How do we mitigate and compensate and think about those direct effects? But it's not only about the effects, it's thinking about the co-benefits and how we can actually make them happen and use those, hopefully, to finance part of the transition.
Right, so thinking broadly. Who else would like to, anybody else?
I just wanted to mention that some of it, we can also look at things like carbon pricing, the border carbon adjustments as a source of revenue for just transition activities, because it's not everything we can look at it as a return on investment for some of the activities that we're thinking of under just transition. And one way to manage such money is also define what is just in terms of indicators that we can measure the progress of it over time. So monitoring and evaluation framework is also essential. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much indeed to the panelists. I've learned really a lot from this discussion, actually. And just 3 really quick takeaways. I think it seems to me that there needs to be a plan for a just energy transition that involves all the different stakeholders. When the plan exists, then there needs to be a broad discussion about how to finance that from different sources, whether it's the private sector, the MDBs, or some kind of mechanism here. And then, just transition affects every aspect of economies and societies. So there needs to be this coordinated action beyond perhaps even what we've seen so far in terms of climate change action. So that just leads me to conclude that there's a lot of work to do. And I'm just very pleased that everybody's started, and I expect this is going to be a bigger part of the discussions at the UN climate talks from now on, a just transition. So that just remains to say thank you for coming, thank you for the insights, and I think there are some refreshments outside if you would care to go out and carry on the discussions there. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks.